just anticipates this. Roethlisberger, Juju Smith-Schuster is blown up.
Most defensive tackles are lucky to get 1 or 2 elite seasons, and maybe they stretch that to 3 if health goes their way. Aaron Donald's career is basically a blueprint of what a true generational talent looks like. From the moment he stepped onto an NFL field until the day he walked away at 32 years old, he remained the best player at his position in football. In most of those years, you could easily argue he was the best player on the field regardless of position. Spent his entire draft process claiming he was too small to be an every down starter, but Aaron Donald spent the next 10 years proving every single one of them wrong and making them look stupid for ever doubting him. Pre-draft conversation around Aaron Donald was actually pretty predictable because a lot of people just thought he would be a great college player but would be too undersized in the pros to be amazing. A lot of analysts also considered that he would just be a third down specialist or a rotational piece and never become what he actually was, defensive homewrecker. He left Pitt after the 2013 season having won the Nagurski, the Bednarik, the Outland, and the Lombardi Award, which meant he took home every major defensive trophy available. He was a Heisman short of a clean sweep. He led the entire FBS with 28.5 tackles for loss, and he wrecked opponents so consistently that coaches designed entire game plans just to keep him out of the backfield. Even with that extra attention, he still found his way to the quarterback. None of that production actually mattered to scouts who only cared about the measurement sheet. He stood at 6'1" and weighed 280 pounds, but the prototype for a 3-technique defensive tackle in the NFL was much bigger than that. The feedback from the league was that he didn't fit most schemes and that bigger offensive linemen would eventually neutralize him. People truly believed he needed a specialized role rather than a full-time starting job, and that was the narrative heading into the 2014 Combine. He went out and ran a 4.68 40, which was the fastest time by a defensive tackle in Combine history at that point. He put up 35 bench press reps and posted elite numbers in the shuttle drills to prove he was the best athlete at his position by a massive margin. Teams still had their doubts though because he wasn't 295 pounds, which really goes to show how much the league valued size over actual football talent back then. Two people in the Rams organization saw past the height and the weight though. Brad Holmes was their director of college scouting at the time, and he went to watch a Pitt practice 30 minutes early on the advice of the defensive coordinator. He found Donald already taped up and ready to go while sitting on a practice dummy with his leg twitching as he waited for everyone else to show up. Holmes knew right then that the football character was elite. Then there was the defensive line coach Mike Waffle, who was so convinced Donald was a right pick that he went into a room full of Rams decision makers and stuck Donald's name tag at the very top of the draft board. He put him above everybody else, including Jadeveon Clowney, who went number 1 overall in that year's draft. And Waffle had actual tears in his eyes when the Rams finally made the pick at number 13. With that pick in the 2014 draft, St. Louis took Aaron Donald, which meant 12 other teams passed on the best D tackle of all time. He became a full-time starter by the middle of his rookie year, and he finished with 9 sacks and 18 tackles for loss. He won Defensive Rookie of the Year in just 12 starts, and NFL teams spent the rest of the season trying to figure out how to block a rookie who was already beating Pro Bowl linemen on a down-and-down basis. That season was actually the lowest statistical bar he would ever set. During the 2015 and 2016 seasons, he made first-team All-Pros in both years, and posted double-digit sacks while being double-teamed as a standard operating procedure. The Rams were a bad football team during this stretch, being in the bottom third of the league in win total in 2016 with just 4 wins. Donald was the only reason offensive coordinators had to spend any real time in the film room before playing Los Angeles. He had already established himself as the most disruptive interior lineman in the league before he even reached his prime. And what came next was something we'd never seen before and something we'll probably never see again. Heading into the 2017 season, Aaron Donald still hadn't been paid like the best defensive player in football because the Rams were dragging their feet. And when Aaron Donald went to sign a new contract and told him what he was expecting, the Rams balked at that offer. Because of that, Aaron Donald actually just held out throughout all of training camp and decided not to show up until after week 1. There was a real concern that he wouldn't be able to come back after missing so much time and dominate, but he returned in week 2 against Washington and looked like he hadn't missed a single day of practice. He finished the year with 11 sacks and 15 tackles for loss, but the most impressive stat was his 5 forced fumbles. Aaron was doing this nearly every week for a defense that was still trying to find its identity under a brand new coaching staff. This was the first year of the Sean McVay era, and the entire culture in Los Angeles was shifting. Jared Goff finally started looking like the number 1 overall pick everyone hoped he would be, and Todd Gurley was arguably the best running back in the league that season. The offense got most of the credit for the Rams going 11-5 and making the playoffs for the first time in over a decade, and they certainly earned that praise. However, the reason that the offense had so much room to operate was because opposing coordinators were losing sleep trying to figure out how to block one man. Every Tuesday, an offensive coordinator was sitting in a film room asking how to account for number 99 on every single down. And since there's no clean answer to that question, the Rams defense was winning before the ball was even snapped. Donald took home his first Defensive Player of the Year award after that season. The award was earned, but the contract was finally coming too. After the season ended, the Rams signed Donald to a 6-year deal worth $135 million with $87 million guaranteed. That made him the highest defensive player in NFL history, but he only held that title for about 24 hours. The Chicago Bears traded for Khalil Mack the very next day and gave him $141 million. So Donald was technically outpaid immediately by a guy in a different jersey. Regardless of the Mack deal, the Rams had finally put the money on the table, and Aaron was heading into the 2018 season with the contract, the hardware, and a full offseason of preparation. Back in 1989, Keith Millard set a defensive record that nobody thought would ever be broken. He put up 18 sacks for the Minnesota Vikings as a defensive tackle, and for nearly 30 years that held because no interior defensive lineman ever came close to breaking that number. That was until Aaron Donald in 2018. Aaron finished the 2018 season with 20.5 sacks to lead the entire league, and you have to remember he did this while playing inside rather than coming off the edge where pass rushers had those natural angles and leverage advantages on every single snap. If you want to see what it looks like when a player reaches his absolute peak, you have to look at the Week 7 game against the 49ers. Donald put up 4 sacks, 9 total tackles, and 5 QB hits during a dominant 39-10 win. It wasn't like San Francisco was starting a bunch of backups either, because they had a line full of competent NFL starters who simply got handled by one man for 60 straight minutes. The 49ers had spent the entire week watching film and specifically preparing to stop him, yet even though they knew exactly what was coming, they still couldn't do a damn thing about it. Most elite edge rushers are lucky to get 4 sacks in a month, but Donald did it in one afternoon against a rival. In the middle of that season is where the stats started to look like something out of a video game. He went on a 5-game tear where he recorded 9.5 sacks against elite talent. He wasn't just stat padding his stats against tired backups or catching teams on a short week, but instead, he was averaging nearly 2 sacks a game for over a month against professional blockers who had prepared all week for him. When NFL Network looked at their pass rush grading database later on, they confirmed that 2018 was the highest single season grade they had ever recorded for any player, and the 4 seasons right behind it were also held by Aaron Donald. The context behind these numbers makes the whole thing even harder to wrap your head around. Film review shows that he was double teamed on nearly 70% of his pass rush snaps, which means teams weren't just hoping their guy could win one-on-one. They were committing 2 blockers to him as a baseline, shifting their protection before the snap, and even using chip blocks from tight ends or running backs just to keep him away from the QB. He still led the league in sacks anyway. And that specific combination of a massive double team rate and a league leading sack total had never happened before, because no defensive tackle had ever been disruptive enough to force that much attention while still producing at that level. That defense carried the Rams all the way to Super Bowl 53. And what happened in that game against New England is actually really important to understand for the Aaron Donald lore. The Patriots held the Rams to just 3 points, and while Donald didn't disappear, Josh McDaniels clearly designed the entire offensive rhythm to take him out of the play. Tom Brady was getting the ball out in under 2 seconds on almost every single dropback, which meant the Patriots were accepting lower upside plays and shorter routes just to keep their QB clean. New England only scored 13 points that night, and the blueprint they used to neutralize Donald actually ended up neutralizing their own offense too. But they still won because the Rams offense couldn't move the ball. His presence on the field forced a strategy adjustment so massive that it basically compromised the opponent's entire playbook. Despite all of that dominance, he wasn't even really in the MVP conversation. If a quarterback had this kind of impact relative to his position, he would be a unanimous winner for the award without any real debate. The fact that a defensive tackle with these historic numbers didn't get legitimate MVP votes tells you everything you need to know about how that award works. It's built around scoring and the stats you see on the scoreboard, so a defensive player wrecking a game plan just doesn't register the same way, even when the impact is clearly higher. He ended up winning his 2nd straight Defensive Player of the Year award, which is obviously the right call, but the larger point about the MVP snub still stands. By the time the 2019 season started to roll around, the Rams were really looking like a different team. Todd Gurley's knee injuries were really starting to catch up with him, and Jared Goff was showing his limitations that would eventually get him traded from LA. The team finished 9-7 and missed the playoffs, but none of those struggles actually touched what Donald was doing on the field. He still put up 12.5 sacks and 20 tackles for loss on his way to a 5th consecutive first-team All-Pro selection. If you look at the history of the league, very few defensive tackles have ever had a single season as good as that. Yet for him, it felt like a down year because the team wasn't wasn't winning. When the 2020 season arrived, he managed to reset the bar for himself once again. He recorded 13.5 sacks and led the entire league in total pressures, which helped the Rams defense finish as the top-ranked unit in the NFL for both points and yards allowed. Brandon Staley was a defensive coordinator for the Rams that year, and he built a scheme that moved Donald all over the formation to keep offensive lines from being able to predict where he would be. Staley gave him angles that the league hadn't really seen from a defensive tackle before, and the results were felt by every player on that defense. Because Aaron was constantly collapsing the pocket and drawing two blockers, the linebackers were able to run free, and the corners were able to get easier coverage matchups. He won his third Defensive Player of the Year award that season, which put him in an elite group with only Lawrence Taylor and J.J. Watt. Those two are both legendary first ballot Hall of Famers, and it was becoming clear that Donald was heading for the exact same destination. During the 2020 playoffs, Troy Aikman was on the broadcast for a Rams win, and made a statement that really puts things into perspective. He told the audience that he played against Reggie White and Lawrence Taylor, but he believed Aaron Donald was the best defensive player he had ever seen. That's a huge claim coming from a Hall of Fame quarterback who actually had to face those legends in their prime. Jason Kelce shared a similar sentiment from the perspective of an offensive lineman who had to actually block him. He noted that in his 13 seasons with the Eagles, Aaron was the only defensive player who forced him to build an entire game plan around, just preventing him from ruining the game. For years, this was a reality for every team playing the Rams, as they had to dedicate every resource possible to stopping just one man. The only thing missing from his resume at this point was a Super Bowl ring, and as the 2021 season approached, the Rams decided it was time to go get it. Everything changed leading into the 2021 season, because during that offseason, the Rams actually sent 2 first-round picks and Jared Goff to the Detroit Lions for Matthew Stafford. Finally, Donald had a team that matched the level of elite play he had been playing at for 7 straight seasons. Stafford was a 13-year veteran who could actually push the ball downfield and handle heavy pressure, which allowed him to run Sean McVay's offense without the limitations that had started to plague Goff. The front office didn't stop there, because at the trade deadline, they brought in Von Miller from Denver and added Odell Beckham Jr. to the wide receiver room. The strategy was clear to everyone watching, as this was a win-now roster built for a very specific window, and Donald was the foundation that held the entire thing together. The phrase "F them picks" started here. The regular season ended with Donald racking up 12.5 sacks and earning his 7th first-team All-Pro selection. While those numbers are impressive, the regular season was almost an afterthought in 2021, because the playoffs are where this specific year became a permanent part of Rams history. The first 2 rounds of the postseason were relatively clean besides an almost Brady comeback in round 2, but Stafford to Cup in that final play versus Tampa helped put them ahead. Then came the NFC Championship game in Los Angeles against San Francisco, which was the hurdle they had to clear before anything else mattered. Going into that game, the 49ers had beaten the Rams 6 times in a row, and there was a heavy psychological weight to the matchup that had become its own narrative. When LA fell behind 17-7 in the second half, the atmosphere felt familiar for all the wrong reasons, and it looked like another year where the Rams would get close, only to hit the San Francisco wall. Aaron simply refused to let that happen. With the game hanging in the balance during the final minutes, the Rams fought all the way back to take the lead. With the final drive imminent, Jimmy G got the ball, and that drive was when the defining play of the game happened. Donald beat his block instantly, got right in Garoppolo's face, and forced a desperate throw that had no business being in the air. The Rams came down with the interception, and the game was over. The Rams were headed to the Super Bowl. That single play snapped the 6-game losing streak against their biggest rival, and it only happened because Aaron became unblockable at the exact moment the season was on the line. There's something important to remember about the entire playoff run, which is that Von Miller had 3.5 sacks across 4 games and looked like a total terror coming off the edge. Miller is a Hall of Famer and a former Super Bowl MVP who had been playing at an elite level for over a decade. But his success in this run was largely because Aaron was drawing 2 blockers on almost every single snap. This left Von in one-on-one situations that even a veteran in the later stages of his career could easily win. When you play on the same line as Aaron Donald, you get opportunities that just don't exist for edge rushers on other teams. And Miller later admitted that Aaron Donald was the best player he ever shared a field with. Super Bowl 56 came down to just one final drive between Los Angeles and Cincinnati. The Rams held a 23-20 lead with less than 2 minutes left on the clock, but the Bengals had the ball and were moving with a lot of momentum. Joe Burrow eventually faced a 4th down at the Rams' 49-yard line, and that was the moment where everything was decided. Sean McVay actually said before this play happened that Aaron Donald's going to make a play. Donald lined up, the ball was snapped, and he beat his man so cleanly that Burrow had absolutely nowhere to go in the pocket. The pass flung incomplete and the game was over. Aaron celebrated by running around the field with his arms wide, pointing directly at his left ring finger. He had made a promise to his daughter after she cried when there was no confetti for them after the first Super Bowl loss, telling her then that they would eventually get back to the big game. She was right there on the field in Inglewood when the confetti finally fell, and he had officially kept his word. Most players who finally win a Super Bowl after chasing it for years look at that ring as the finish line. They feel like they've done it all and proven their point, but what Donald did is the next part of the story that separates him from almost everyone else who has ever played in the NFL. The championship didn't slow him down at all, and he came back for the next 2 years playing like he still had something to prove, even though every fan and analyst knew there was nothing left for him to achieve. The 2022 season stands as the only outlier in an otherwise perfect career. A high ankle sprain in week 13 ended his year after just 11 games and 5 sacks, which resulted in the only time between 2015 and 2023 that he wasn't named a first-team All-Pro. He still made the Pro Bowl, and for any other defensive tackle in the league, a season like that would be considered a productive year cut short by bad luck. For Donald, it felt like a strange dip in production only because the standard he had set for himself was so incredibly high. He returned healthy in 2023, but the Rams were widely expected to be a team in the middle of a painful transition. The national media spent the entire fall questioning if the Rams teams was still rebuilding or if the championship window under Sean McVay had officially slammed shut. Donald clearly didn't care about the outside noise because he put up 8 sacks, 16 tackles for loss, and 23 QB hits on his way to an 8th and final first-team All-Pro selection. He basically dragged a young and inexperienced roster to a 10-7 record and a playoff berth, which was a result that nobody saw coming. Even though they lost a close game to Detroit in the first round, it felt like the Rams were building something special again. But we soon found out it wouldn't include Aaron. On March 15th of 2024, he announced his retirement on social media using just 2 words: "I'm complete." That's a perfect way to describe his career. He finished with 10 Pro Bowls, 8 first-team All-Pros, 3 Defensive Player of the Year awards, and 111 career sacks. He's the only player in NFL history to earn 8 first-team All-Pro nods at defensive tackle, putting him in a category with other defensive legends like Reggie White, Lawrence Taylor, and Bruce Smith. Donald belongs in that conversation because he was the best player at his position for nearly a decade without a single break, and he did it while facing schemes designed specifically to stop him every single week. Aaron Donald set a baseline for himself that most Hall of Famers couldn't reach on their best days, and he turned the first-team All-Pro nod into a yearly tradition. He maintained that elite standard for 8 of his 10 seasons, right up until he walked away, and we will simply never see a defensive tackle dominate the league like that again. So there you have it. Subscribe if you're new, and watch this thanks video if you haven't already. Thanks for watching.